all virtual learning and distribution of 2,000 kits that went home to young students to now starting to move into in-person programs and getting youth more engaged outdoors, especially as we move into the summer. So we're excited about that, and also have some great restoration work happening. We just completed the first phase of our urban forest tree planting effort, which was about 400 new trees on streets, parks, and neighborhoods in Watsonville, and are doing lots of great restoration work. This month is also Earth Month. So with the city of Watsonville, Regeneración Pajaro Valley, Bike Santa Cruz County, and Watsonville Wetlands Watch, we've got a ton of great events that will be found at all the farmers markets. We're gonna all be at the farmers markets. We've got the return of our 4th Saturday restoration volunteer event this month in April. That will be a socially distanced, masked outdoor restoration event at Struve Slough, meeting at Hope Park. We're also launching an Adopt a Tree program this month where Watsonville residents can take home fruit and shade trees as part of our urban forest work. So lots of great Earth Month activities that you can find out more on our website, as well as the City of Watsonville's website. And with that, I'd like to just say thank you so much for being here and continuing to be a part of the work of Watsonville Wetlands Watch. I'm particularly excited about tonight's talk. Native plants are a huge part of the work that we do. We've got a great group of folks that work in our native plant nursery, volunteering, as well as in our native plant demonstration gardens, and lots of room, especially as we move into more in-person type activities. So just super excited for tonight's talk, and appreciative of Mike joining us this evening. So with that, I'll hand it over to Noelle.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. And yeah, I see some of our amazing plant helpers in the audience tonight too. That's really exciting. So how it's going to go tonight is Mike has been very gracious and said that if you have any questions during the talk, if you want to chat them, if you want to type them into the chat box, feel free. I'll be keeping an eye on it, and we'll have some pauses and he'll answer any questions that you all have. If you run into any kind of technical difficulties, please feel free to also message me in the chat box. I'm not Noelle under there, I'm Watsonville Wetlands Watch, but feel free. Would love to help out anybody who starts experiencing any issues. But hopefully it'll be smooth sailing tonight. And I am so excited. I will say I have known Mike for a number of years now, and I'm super thrilled that we got to do this with him. He's just a fantastic person and scientist. And to give a little bit of background, Mike Rotter first became interested in botany during high school when he attempted to graft plants in his parents' backyard. After finding out he could make a career running around in the forest and fields and looking at plants, he never looked back. Mike earned a bachelor's and master's degrees from Northern Michigan University and a PhD from Northern Arizona University. His research focused on the interactions of plants with insects and has taken him to habitats such as the boreal forest of Canada, the deserts of California, and the British countryside. Mike has also worked for various organizations, including the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy and the National Park Service. Currently, he is serving as an assistant professor of field botany at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah. So thank you so much, Mike, for coming tonight. We are incredibly excited to hear everything from you about our pollinator friends and their potential enemies. And with that, I will have you take it away.
Great. So thanks, Noelle, for the introduction, and really thank you for everybody for having me here this evening. And so, yeah, today I want to talk about an area that I actually don't tread into all that much, but I seem to be kind of always drawn into quite a bit, and that's pollinators. You know, usually when we think about pollinators, there are these great kind of mutualistic beneficial relationships that we all know and love. And in an intro ecology course, we would say this is an example of a mutualism. But I want to, usually in my work, I study antagonistic relationships. These relationships where kind of things don't always work out for one of the partners in it. And I want to talk about pollinators in that regard, because we all think of these like lovely relationships, like these nice flowers, like this solidago here, and this nice little fluffy bumblebee. But really, it's hiding kind of a little bit of a seedy underbelly to it. So I just want to first start off and with my acknowledgments. I always like to do that. So a little bit of what I'm going to be talking about tonight comes from research that I did during my PhD, as well as some of the work that I'm doing currently now with some of my students at Utah Valley University. And I always like to point out all the different little groups that have given me a little bit of funding and help over the years, especially a lot of native plant societies. These are just some of the groups that I've worked with. And in particular, I always like to give a plug when I'm talking to a group, for the group that I'm talking to, because they were gracious enough to allow me to come. And also, they really do provide a lot of important local benefits for us. And so one of the things that I heard Jonathan talk about is you guys have a native plant nursery. And, for me, that's like a very personal thing, because that's where I got a lot of my start as a botanist, is working in native plant nurseries and really understanding the impact they can have on making our communities a lot better place. So, please, do what you can to support them, whether it's, financially or just a little bit of your time. A lot of that goes a long way for sure. Okay. So I'm going to get started, and I'm going to try to use kind of a little engagement tool here. We'll see how well it works. It's called Poll Everywhere. So if you want to join, I'm going to ask some questions, and we're going to try to get our pollinator discussion going. But you can go to this website, pollev.com, and if you enter Michael Rate, the R got cut off, so you got to watch that, 928, or you can text the code response there. So the first thing I want to just ask everybody for responding to is I want you to think, what are pollinators? If I were to say, what's a pollinator, what comes to your mind first? And you can just respond. If you're having trouble getting into Poll Everywhere, feel free to just put it in the chat, and Noel can tell me as well. But I'm just kind of asking in general what that might be. And I'm going to see if it's working. It might not be working because that's how the internet goes during this pandemic time.
Ooh, Alejandro is saying insects. I was thinking the same thing.
So yeah, insects, kind of fun things, plants, animals, good. Spread, so you have like a lot of they're a way to spread things around, which is what they're about.
Ooh, and Christine was saying wind.
Wind, yep. So one thing we don't think about is how it's not always animals that are moving things around too.
And I'm typing in pollev.com, and it's wanting me to say pollen, which makes sense for this. Let me get this all in here. All right, I think I just got everything into the chat box.
Oh, cool. Sometimes it takes a little bit, depending on bandwidth around here. So
yeah. Well, and everyone feel free to just enter it into the chat box too. Yep. I'll keep reading them as I go along, or as we go along, I should say. Let's see. Ooh, bats, birds, insect, and wind. Thank you, Sharon. Ooh, I love the thought of the bats. I never think of bats when I think of pollinators, and that's obviously a mistake.
Yep. So there's a lot of like really cool stuff. And so a lot of things we think about is we think about these organisms that are involved in these things. We also think about them as having these benefits and spread and things like that. which are really great. And that's why, I think with a lot of our environmental issues that we've been kind of facing, and pollinators have been a really big focus of that, because they matter a lot to us. A lot of our food are pollinated from these animal processes, and a lot of the organisms that are involved in this are things that we like and want to have around. I know my father personally doesn't like bats that much, but some of the best times I can think of in my evenings, we're just sitting in the backyard watching the bats come out. And so these interactions really mean a lot to us, and we see them as this kind of beautiful things. But plants and insects and animals really don't always have this great relationship a lot of times. They're two very distinct ways of living your life, and they can easily switch from being really good partners to kind of mortal enemies in a lot of ways. One of my favorite groups of plants are the sundews, these kind of small carnivorous plants, and their leaves are just covered in these sticky glands. And what they do is when an insect comes along and lands on it, they get trapped, and the honeydew or sundew kind of grabs them and starts to slowly digest them, like this unfortunate damselfly here that I found. But at the same time, even though this plant eats and kills insects for a living, essentially, it also needs insects for good too. And I don't want to say good, but they need them to make its own life. These plants, Drosera, are pollinated by insects, so they're expecting their food to essentially help them get their seeds to the next generation. Especially a lot of little flies and gnats that we tend to find kind of being consumed by these. And I think this dichotomy here really kind of points out one of the kind of the big mysteries of pollination is, how do you have these two very distinct life forms that have their own goals, their own needs, but how do they get into these very fine relationships, and why do they get into these relationships, and what does that mean for kind of the trajectory of plants on our planet? So before we talk about pollination, I think it's important in pollinators, it's important to sit back a little bit and think about, why do we even see pollination on our planet? Because a lot of organisms out there, especially a lot of plants, get along fine without an animal helper to help them move around their reproductive units like pollen and getting to that female ovary on the plant. And some of our more successful groups don't do that. If you think about ferns, for instance, they don't mind that there's no insects around helping them. In fact, they don't even have pollen. They just use spores, and those are able to get into very kind of small, weird habitats just by passive movement of wind and water, and they grow fine. We also have a lot of our flowering plants, such as our grasses, and especially one of my favorite groups of grasses, the sedges. They don't rely on insects at all. In fact, they they have a little stalk up here, and then they blow their wind. The wind comes, blows their pollen, and they hopefully hits these female eggs right down there, and they can form seeds, and that works perfectly fine for them. Sedges and grasses dominate most of the world. If you're up in the Arctic, it's sedge everywhere, and then if you're in kind of maybe the Central Valley and some of our more natural areas, it's pretty much grass dominated areas, and so they do really well. And then lastly, most of the gymnosperms, almost all of them, do the same thing. They use wind to blow their pollen, and the female seeds get it. So things like conifers and whatnot that dominate our high elevation areas, kind of like this pic from Yosemite, they're doing really well, and they don't need this little help to kind of help move them. But there has to be a good reason, right, that we have all these plants that need help moving their, essentially their sexual reproduction units around for them. If we think about it, really, it's kind of a really clever way. Because plants, they're going to produce kind of two types of what we call gametes. So they're essentially, what they have is half the genetic kind of units of the parent. And they do this to allow kind of mixing and kind of allow to get the good genes, kind of the best of the two parents into their offspring for a better chance for their offspring to survive. And they do this through pollen, like this monkey flower pollen right here. And I'm going to apologize right now for all the monkey flower I'm going to talk about, because I think about monkey flower every day of my life, because that's what I study. But this monkey flower pollen grain, and like any pollen grain, they have to make it. Males are really easy and cheap to make. So, making a bunch of pollen's not that big of a deal a lot of the time. But if you look at the kind of inside of those flowers, they have a lot of these little female ovules in there. And those are really expensive to make a lot of times. Because not only do you have to build this nice little fruit and this little thing for your seedling to develop in, but this is highly nutritious and a lot of things want to get at it. And it's easy for it to get lost really fast. And so it's a really major investment to make these things. And if you're making these things and putting all those resources, and let's say you're a little guy like this Perry's monkey flower right here, you want to make sure your genes are getting to the right spot and you're not wasting any, kind of throwing any out into the wild that's going to land and not get anywhere. And if you can get some little help to move that around, that's going to be really nice for you in particular, because that you're not wasting anything and you're going to be more assured that these little ovules aren't just going to be kind of wasted energy, especially if you live in a bad spot like these little monkey flowers do. So our idea of what pollinators are and where they come from has really been shaped by the fossil record quite a bit. One of the things that we see that's really amazing is that most of the plants we have on our planet are what we call angiosperms. They're the flowering plants. So when you think about a plant, you're usually thinking about an angiosperm. So they have fruits and flowers, and they're super abundant, and by far, probably more than 3/4 of all of our plants are these angiosperms. Green algae, which is a true plant, comes in a little bit in there. We have a lot of mosses in our world, and then a little bit of ferns and gymnosperms, like conifers and things like that are in gymnosperms there that kind of make up the rest. But even more amazing than this overall diversity is that the angiosperms are a really new group. Way back in the day in the Cenozoic, if you can remember back that far, all of a sudden overnight, we've seen this kind of huge diversity in angiosperms. And pretty much right around this time, we saw most of the families that you would be familiar with today were apparent back then. And so we had this kind of really interesting kind of overnight, as far as the fossil record's concerned, appearance of flowering plants. In fact, this appearance has been known for a really long time and it's been a lot of kind of a mystery for a lot of botanists. Charles Darwin was really fascinated by plants and actually spent a lot of his work working on plants. And he called this the abominable mystery about the sudden appearance of angiosperms. And, as these old Englishmen like to do back in the day, they would write long letters to each other talking about the current debates of the time. And one of the persons that Darwin talked to a lot was this guy named Joseph Hooker, who was a very important botanist during this time period. And Darwin would speculate on the origins of these angiosperms. He was actually pretty close because he was talking about how they probably came from this group called the Cycads. And today we think that might be the case. But it still kind of is relatively a mystery of how did we get all these angiosperms so fast? And when we talk about flowering plants, there's a couple of things we really got to point out. And part of it is flowering plants are just lovely to have around. We put them in our art, we sing songs about them. If you came into my office, I have pictures of plants all over my office and they're all flowering plants. Though I do have a couple sedges that have true flowers on them. And if you think about what you had for lunch today, it probably included what we call a fruit. These kind of really nice structures that have these kind of big units of energy that help those seeds get dispersed or help the seed grow into becoming that flower. And I think about the plants I like, and for instance, every year I plant a ton of morning glories. This is Calistegia purpurea, a native shore monkey or a morning glory out there, and they're just wonderful to have around. And these traits are really a good kind of reason why the angiosperms have been so successful. So I want to try another quick poll. And I want to ask you guys is, why are so many angiosperms out there? Why do we see all this diversity in flowers, these flowering plants? Why aren't like most of our species gymnosperms or mosses out there?
And again, feel free to answer in the chat box as well if you're having any issues with this one. I know it's always fun trying to figure out some tech stuff when everyone's on the internet at the same time.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm using you guys as a little bit of a guinea pig to test pilot this. So.
Thank you. Well, happy to help. Let's see.
People love them. I mean, yeah, think of I was looking at your guys' native plant list that you guys have coming up for the plant cell, and there's a couple not gymnosperms on there, but they're all angiosperms because they're great. They grow in diverse habitats. They do fun things in our society. Yeah, we love them.
Cindy was saying food.
Yep, summer food. Almost all of our food are angiosperms. That really nice fruit in there. Yep, flowers attract, they need to attract anything they can to get them getting into the next generation, get those genes pushed out. That's really what they're going for, and it's great.
Ooh, Daniel is saying it's a great way to entice the desirable pollinators to come before the non-desirable ones come and eat everything.
Yeah, yep. So yeah, you want to get like those good insects to your yard that you like, that can provide a service to you, kind of these ecosystem services that are so important to us. So they're coming in. And they're beautiful, which I think is a really important point to make. We associate them with love. That's what we give to our loved ones. We buy them flowers and things like that. In fact, in one of my courses tomorrow morning, that's what we're going to talk about, is how we use flowers as symbols for a lot of things. Great. So those are awesome things. Why do we have so many flowers? And these are all excellent reasons. And as for a biological standpoint too, flowers are a really wonderful thing because they're allowing you to kind of move things around and kind of, again, so you don't have to spend that much energy. And in fact, when we talk about flowers, in this kind of pollination thing, even some of the other plants out there are kind of getting in on the act, so to speak. This is one of my favorite mosses. And when I did my master's on Isle Royale, I was studying moose and how they eat plants on Isle Royale. And one of the things you would find is a lot of moose poop. And these mosses, this is called a splachnum moss. It doesn't have a common name, but these mosses love to grow on moose poop. And it's hard for them to find this moose poop. So what they do is they grow these really kind of cool stalks known as sporophytes that smell really bad. And you have insects coming to the moose poop anyhow. And the insects like to crawl on these, and they'll pick up spores on them and move it around. So we kind of see what we call convergent evolution, right? They don't have flowers and things like that, but they kind of have these ways to get around that in order to kind of get on this pollinating train and essentially allow theirs to take. So if we stop back though and look at what we think are the first flowers, our fossil record has some really interesting things to say about us. This fossil came from China, and it's one of what we think it's our earliest known fossil plant that we have, a couple million years before the Cretaceous really started. And, our fossils aren't that good. And so we have to kind of think about what they probably looked like and function. And these early flowers were really big. And much, much bigger than a lot of the flowers we have today. And they have these kind of big parts to them. They have these big structures that kind of look like petals here. And then you have these big reproductive structures there and these kind of bigger ovaries down there. And so these fossils are really interesting to us botanists for a lot of different reasons. And one of the reasons is that if we look at current flowers and what we think are closer related to these older flowers, we see a lot of similarities to them. And a lot of our flowers have this kind of big structure design. So magnolias, which I was just at a botanic garden this weekend, and they're blooming, doing really cool things right now here in Utah Valley. And you can see they're huge, right? They have these big petals that look a lot like leaves because they are leaves. And you have this kind of big center here. And one of the reasons why we think that these flowers have these huge structures is that they're really kind of a generalist flower. Anything can pollinate these things. You don't have to kind of be in a specialized relationship. You can kind of be flying around and see, hey, that looks like a fun thing to check out. I'll go see if there's some nectar. And so you can easily land on it and kind of walk around. And it's thought that, when these things kind of started showing up, there wasn't a lot of options out there. The dating pool was relatively small, and you kind of had to take what you get. But as we have seen kind of plants kind of evolve on our Earth, we start to see a lot more specialized structures going on. And if you think about a lot of the plants we have today, they have really kind of very fancy flowers, so to speak. Blueberries, for instance, in the heath family have these bell-shaped flowers, and it's not so easy to get in. You kind of have to have the right parts to be able to kind of hang yourself down and crawl in to get to the nectar and also get pollen. Irises and gentians have these really long tubes that you kind of have the right nose to get down in there and get the pollen. And then orchids, like this amorous orchids here, have probably the most specialized flowers. In fact, they kind of tend to trick insects into coming to them because the insects think they're actually going to get a mating opportunity, but instead the mating opportunity is really for the flower. And so a lot of these orchids, even here in kind of the orchids that we have in more temperate areas, like in the mountains and things like that, do this. They do this kind of trickery here. And so the next question we can really ask is, why be a generalist or why be a specialist? Because it seems like both strategies work really well. And one of the lessons I like to take is from monkey flower. Like I said, I'm going to apologize for all the monkey flower. But what we see is monkey flower, which is a common native plant in California and throughout the American West, has been introduced throughout the globe, especially into the United Kingdom. And in the United Kingdom, it comes across some other monkey flowers too, especially some species from South America. And what happens is a lot of these pollinators can't readily choose between the two. They kind of are like, well, I like monkey flowers and this one kind of looks the same, so they go to it. So these South American monkey flowers have these really nice red dots on it, where our native monkey flowers don't have those red dots. But what happens in Britain is the pollinators don't discriminate. And so what they do is they just freely move pollen from either or. And so you get these kind of really interesting hybrids that form with all these different shapes and color patterns. But the problem is the hybrids don't get the best of both worlds. In fact, they get the worst of both worlds. And a lot of these plants are actually sterile and they can't reproduce anymore. So they're kind of a dead end evolutionary for these plants. And so the identity and who's pollinating you really matters a lot for plants, because you don't want to kind of outsource to the wrong species, because otherwise your genes aren't going anywhere.
We have a couple of questions, Mike.
Go for them.
There was a good question. Why are they called monkey flower?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Chuck Linnaeus, way back in the day, named him. They named him the genus Mimulus to mime, and the idea is they look like a face. And I think personally, I don't see it too much, but maybe I've spent too much time with them. But if you just really squint your eyes on it, you might be able to see the little monkey face coming out there.
Nice. And Patricia was wondering, are any of these in this photo sticky monkey?
None of these are the sticky monkey flower yet. I do have a picture of one coming up. And those are a really fantastic shrub, one of my personal favorites. So
nice.
Cool. And so this kind of jealousy of pollinators and kind of selfishness of trying to get your own pollinator, we see this over and over in the plant kingdom. And this is reflected as if you take a look at any botanic book, flip open the chart, they'll should have a chart in there about flower shapes. And there's all these massive arrays of flowers. One of the things we love about them. And if you think about all these different shapes and sizes that flowers come in, think about all the different pollinators out there. Everything from insects, and these insects are just incredibly diverse. We have flies with little lucky mouths, these kind of straws that our butterflies have, and these really long tongues that bumblebees have, and anything to flower or hummingbirds too. And a lot of birds participate in this. And, other mammals do. We see rodents are really good pollinators. Bats are excellent pollinators where they are. And really what we're seeing is very much a specialization. And this kind of jealousy of pollinators and kind of getting into your own really shows up in like what I like to call an evolutionary dating game, because you really want to make sure you get the right date for your flowers, so to speak. And monkey flowers are another great example of this. In monkey flowers, we have a whole bunch of red flowers that are all kind of related to each other. But one of our monkey flowers, which we call the cardinal monkey flower up here, is actually closely related to white and pink flowers. And so if we zoom in on this and think about what's going on with these flowers, a really kind of fun story emerges from it. So flower colors we know are controlled by a single gene within these plants, these monkey flowers. And what we can see happen with a single gene is that if any little change to that can really have a dramatic result. And within these flowers, red flowers are generally pollinated by birds. That's why, you see those red hummingbird feeders out there. Though you shouldn't put red dye in your feeder, just kind of a PSA there for those hummingbirds out there. Just make sure to fill it out and have a red base. That usually works. And insects generally favor kind of lighter flowers overall. And a lot of that deals with what spectrum they can see in and interact. So a lot of monkey flowers in particular, like this one, this is Mimulus lewis's monkey flower, is pollinated by bees, and cardinal monkey flower is pollinated by these hummingbirds. But if we have a gene that comes across and kind of changes the flower color a little bit, which we actually see happens quite a bit in monkey flowers, we kind of start to see some weird things develop. So these red monkey flowers will start to be pinkish, but they'll still have that same shape to them. And a lot of our pink monkey flowers will get a little more red. And what happens is we kind of get a switch starts to occur. And so these red flowers start getting pollinated more by hummingbirds, and these insects start to ignore those, and the insects will switch to the pink flowers again. And so what kind of happens in our family story here, we get these kind of weird relationships where these red flowers kind of come out of be more closely connected to our pink flowers. And this has been all sorts of trouble for people that try to keep track of names and family relationships, because as we've kind of learned about these relationships, that we've had to really rethink how we name these plants and what are closely related to each other quite a bit. In fact, a lot of our monkey flowers in California, you guys are lucky because they're all still Mimulus cardinalis, but a lot of them have been changed into other names because of these issues. So, but it's not always just these pollinators or these flowers kind of controlling the game, right? The insects really make a lot of choices. And if you're a checker spot butterfly like this and you're looking out at a beautiful meadow with all these flowers, you kind of have to do your own dating game again, this kind of Tinder of pollination, so to speak. And you have all these choices, right? And all these different things that are going to attract you. Do I go to the big flowers? Do I go to the ones that tell me where to go? Do I go to the ones like the sticky monkey flower down here where I have to like really get in and to get that nectar? And so there's a lot of choices that these pollinators need to make. So we'll do another quick kind of ask you guys is, if you're a pollinator, what do you want to go after? What's your kind of flower of your fantasies, so to speak, that you would go after?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Yeah. So what do you have to think about if you're a pollinator? And also, don't be afraid to just throw that in the chat. You know, I know sometimes Poll Everywhere doesn't work. Easy access to pollen, so that's a really good one. So a lot of these pollinators actually want the pollen. They actually want to eat the pollen. It's not kind of a side reward for them, and it's, you don't want to put in work on it. I definitely feel that way a lot of days when I'm going out for food. Really colorful things. You know, I think we ourselves look like really colorful flowers. Open and ready, yeah, ones that are ready to get there and get them going. Lots of nectar. You got like really sweet, sugary treat that you're going for.
Yeah,
so these are great.
Sorry, and just so you know, really fast, I'm not sure if you can see it, but we've got a pretty big red line, a little pen mark on the left side of the screen.
Oh, okay.
Just wanted to let you know, no worries. Just wanted to let you know. And we've got, some really great answers in the chat. I'm going to type them in because they're not super long. That's perfect.
Cool. Here, I can just clear the drawings.
Oh, perfect.
Abundance. Yep. So that's a good one. Like if you got the MO of a plant you like, you're just going to keep going to it over and over. Markings that tell you where to land, making it easy again. So these are all really excellent things, and pollinators choose for these things. You guys are quite the pollinators out there. I hand pollinate a lot of plants, and I'll tell you firsthand that the big open ones are a lot easier to get at than having to jam the Q-tip down the throat of a poor unsuspecting monkey flower. Good aromas. Yep, that's a really good one. Something that we like out of a date too. They should have a fresh aroma that we're going into it. So, go for it, Noelle.
Oh, sorry. Robin is saying lots of flowers on one plant, so access to a whole field of nectar and pollen in one space.
Yep, and those are really good things. And we're actually going to talk a little bit about that one too. So pollinators, what they want, what they're getting out of this relationship is food. They're getting a lot of nutrition from that. So a lot of insects in particular, they can't produce certain amino acids, and they actually get them from the nectar or the pollen they're eating from these plants. They also want easy access because, you don't want to put out all that energy. You want to eat and kind of get on with your life. They also want predictability. It's, if you have lay eggs and they hatch, you want to make sure those eggs are going to be timed up to get the right flower so they can get that nutrient so they themselves can live. And you also want proximity and a good habitat to do this in. If you're kind of out there in an area where you have your own predators trying to kill you, that's going to be hard for you to kind of get your food and make it through the day. On the other hand, plants want a little bit different thing. They also want predictability. They want to make sure when their flowers bloom, they're going to get hit by a pollinator that's going to move them around. They also want a loyal partner because, again, they don't want to waste their pollen getting into some, other species or something like that. That's not going to be beneficial. They also want efficiency. So they want a pollinator to grab that stuff, take it, and they want it to work the first time, not, 5 attempts or something like that. Often when I'm pollinating my flowers, I have to go back the next day and try again because I'm not a bumblebee. But they also want to be cheap because producing nectar and pollen, again, is costly. And so they want to produce as little bit of that as possible, but still kind of get the end product. And the problem with this is we end up with kind of, when we compare these lists, some kind of mismatches to them, that, you know, they're going into this great relationship together, this partnership, but there's some underhandled doings. You know, the plants want to be cheap, right? They don't want to give them, all the pollinators, all the food they need. They want to give them enough just to kind of get them back. They also don't want to give too easy access too, because you want a loyal partner. They don't want just anything coming around. And what this results in, and if we look at these pollinator relationships, it results in a lot of kind of sneaking around and breaking up that we see in these. This blue flower, this blue butterfly here, he was just visiting, actually it was a she was just visiting this primulose monkey flower here. And you can see it's kind of slinking away. I liked this picture because it has this kind of emotion to it. It's like it knows it's about to do something wrong and it's about to go to another plant. In fact, I watched this butterfly go to a different monkey flower after that. And this is great for the butterfly, in fact, because it's getting more pollen. But this plant right here, that's not good for it, because that pollen's going to get rubbed off in a different species, and it's usually not going to be kind of advantageous if a hybrid can even work in that. And insects are really bad partners a lot of time, because they also don't want to do a lot of work here. One thing that we see a lot of pollinators do is they like to just kind of skip the boring stuff and not put in the work and just go right to it. And what you'll see a lot of pollinators will do, especially bumblebees, you know, we all like bumblebees and think they're these fun things that are these nice fuzzy wuzzies out there. But really, they're kind of thieves in a lot of ways. A lot of bumblebees will actually drill holes into the flower and kind of circumvent the sexual parts and get right at the good stuff, that nectar. And so this plant just spent all this time producing all this nectar, but the bumblebees, you know, they just kind of go right at it and skip that. And this is a really big issue for a lot of plants. And probably in response to this, we see a lot of plants have very unique flower structure to them, because it kind of prevents this action from happening. Peas like vetches and things like that, which we have a lot of wonderful natives of this family, they kind of have this structure that kind of forces the bumblebee to kind of have to go in there if they want. It's hard for the bumblebee to kind of get in through this side. Orchids do a lot of the same thing too. They put out this big flap, and it's hard for the bees to land and kind of get around there. So they have to kind of go at it straight on. We also see these kind of very complex structures form when plants will kind of start to shift down their ovaries deep down in them. And so that, again, makes those pollinators have to go a certain way that the plants want to do. A lot of our pitcher plants do the same thing. They kind of route certain insects into a specific part of the structure to kind of prevent them from robbing those things. And plants also fight back in their own kind of sneaky way too. Plants have to produce this nectar, right, to get the kind of entice pollinators to come to them. But some plants have kind of figured out that you can just kind of fake it till you make it. One of the areas that I've studied a lot in, especially up in Canada, we've studied these calypso orchids, which are pretty rare on the East Coast and becoming increasingly rare at our higher elevation mountains. Calypso orchids are kind of neat because they don't produce nectar. They don't have a sweet reward. But a lot of times when you find them, they're going to grow with these milkweeds here, or milk vetches here, called the genus Polygala. And polygalas produce a lot of nectar, and bees love coming to them. But bees, you know, in kind of their sugar-induced madness as they're flying around trying to get as much as they can, they don't always make the best decisions. And we think that these calypso orchids are actually tricking the pollinators to come to them. If they can look just enough like a polygala, then they can get a pollinator to come to them. And they don't have to put in that work. It's kind of a high risk, but a really high reward there. Because again, you can just put all that energy into making fruits and these kind of elaborate flowers, and you don't have to worry about sugar and all the kind of consequences that come to that. But even between these, you get a lot of competition, right? If you think about it from a human perspective, if somebody's kind of trying to steal your lover from you or something like that, you're not going to like that. And so we see a lot of competition for plants between species. One of the big challenges we have with global change is all the invasive species we start to see showing up. And one of the reasons why invasive species are so kind of bad for our ecosystems is they push out a lot of our native species. And they do this through some really kind of manipulative ways, really, to give themselves advantages. On the East Coast of the United States, our monkey flowers out there are actually purple, and they kind of have these kind of nice flowers on them, kind of here and there. And one of the big wetland invasives we have are purple loosestrife, probably one of the worst wetland invasives we have that has literally taken over probably millions of acres in North America. And loosestrife has kind of an advantage over monkey flowers because loosestrife produces much, much more flowers, and they're a lot more abundant. And if you're, remember, a lazy pollinator, you're coming along, one of the things you're looking for, right, is that abundance and kind of lots of flowers on the same plant because you don't have to go very far. And so if you're a pollinator and you're flying around a bunch of invaded fields with purple loosestrife, are you going to be able to find this little tiny monkey flower way down here, or are you going to just go to purple loosestrife because you know you can get a quick snack? And so what we see is in these invaded areas with loosestrife, native pollinators really don't get selected, or plants get selected for. We see the non-natives really kind of take over the pollinating community. The pollinators tend to go to them. And so we see this big shift, this kind of positive feedback. So they're getting the pollinators, they're getting reproduced, and their natives unfortunately aren't. And one of the problems is the pollinators might not actually know what's good for them. A lot of our natives produce more nectar that are more nutritious, and they're able to kind of be a lot better plants for these pollinators, but the pollinators just don't know better. It's kind of like instead of eating a well-balanced deal, you're sitting home eating pork rinds and Mountain Dew all day, and that's not good for anybody. So the question all this could be at the end is, why even commit to this kind of awful relationship in a lot of ways? You have all these cheating and this kind of backhanded work that goes on. And flowers are costly and things like to eat them. I often see a lot of animals eating flowers because they're full of good nutrition and they're kind of just hanging out and they're easy to find. But these pollinators have, these plants in particular, to get their genes kind of into the next generation, have a couple tricks. And one trick I really think is kind of an ingenious trick are you can use chemicals against them. And we see this a lot, especially in tobacco. And what we see is that tobacco generally is an insecticide. It's really hard for animals to digest it, and it can make them sick. But it's highly addictive, which we all know really too well how addictive tobacco can be. And what we've found is a lot of people have kind of tested this, and they've given bumblebees different levels of pollination or nicotine concentrations. And we actually see that at fairly high levels, even 2.5 parts per million, which is a lot of nicotine. It would definitely wouldn't be good for you to get that. Pollinators really like that. And it reduces overall a little bit of how much the pollinators will do, but these pollinators often take kind of the risk in order to get more nicotine a lot of times. And we actually don't see a big drop off until we put like kind of these unreasonable amounts of nicotine. 50 parts per million is really high, and you would never find that in nature. But even at these low levels, we see quite a bit of pollination going on. And it's literally because they get these pollinators addicted to their love to come to these things over and over. And so it's a way you can kind of double dip with these chemical compounds to defend yourself and also bring in more animals.
Mike, how do they give nicotine to the bumblebees?
Yeah, so one of the things that's really fun about working with insects in the lab, and I rear a lot of butterflies for a lot of my research, is that you can get a little a cup, a thimble, and once the insects get a little used to you messing with them, you can actually unfurl their tongues with like a little pin, kind of unfurl it and put it right into the thimble, and they'll drink it up. I feed my cat or my butterflies Gatorade. Just a pro tip: the blue stuff they seem to like the best. But they are able to kind of manipulate these diets just by doing that. And so in these studies, what they've done is they've taken some sugar water, put a little nicotine in, and seen if the bees would kind of learn that behavior to keep coming back to them. So it's a really kind of a fun little system to work on.
Wow, thank you. That's really interesting.
Yeah. So before I get into kind of my last example, one of the things I like to point out about pollinators is that, there's a lot of options for them out there. We have the phrasing that there's a lot of fish in the sea, but for pollinators and plants, with the pollinators, there's a lot of flowers out there. And for the pollinators, there's a lot of insects out there. Think about all these different thistle species we have. Each of them have different pollinators coming to them. And these pollinators can switch pretty easily. And so if they're kind of see like they're getting a bad deal, we can see these kind of shifting in pollinators. But the consequences of this is remember, you want a loyal pollinator as a plant, and you want to figure out ways to encourage the certain species to come to you to pollinate you. And so this is a way we get a lot of really new species. So one of the projects I'm working on now, especially with a couple of my really excellent students here at Utah Valley, is we're looking at this issue in rabbit bush. So if you go a little further inland from where you guys are at, you start to see these these gloriously big shrubs. They're woody shrubs with tons of yellow flowers in the fall on them. And these shrubs are typically the species called nauseous rabbit bush. They're kind of a little sticky to them. But these shrubs are just maddening if you're a taxonomist, because they have tons of subspecies. There's over 200 subspecies named, which is too many subspecies, and it's not that many there should be. But what we're focusing on is two kind of subspecies that really live together a lot. We have this one, Hololuca, or what I like to call cinder rabbit bush. And then we have Oreophylla, which I like to call mountain rabbit bush, which is the mountain rabbit bush is greenish, and this cinder rabbit bush is kind of this tan cinder color. And what we see is that these cinder rabbit bushes live at kind of lower elevations in drier habitats. And Noel, you'll probably remember these pictures from Flagstaff. And up on top of mountains, we see the green subspecies, this mountain subspecies. In fact, Oreophylla here, it doesn't mean they love Oreos. It means they love mountains. They're the mountain lovers. And between these kind of two extremes, we see a lot of overlap in where these species are. And so we see like these species are really interacting and flowering at the same time and dealing with pollinators. So one of the things we did is we went out and we took species of the cinder one and brought them with species and kind of put them together with species of the mountain one and kind of brought them to a site dominated by the cinder one. And we did the same at the high elevation, where we took the green, the higher elevation mountain subspecies, and brought some more of this lower elevation species up to it. And we saw in these local habitats in areas where the dominant was the mountain one or the dominant was the lower elevation one, we wanted to see what did the local pollinators like. And what we saw is this kind of home field advantage. So if you were a lower elevation one at lower elevations, you got more pollinators that came to you. Whereas if you were at higher elevations in a higher elevation subspecies, the pollinators knew you and they came to you more. And this was a fun project because we basically made these bouquets and sat out and with binoculars and just counted every time a pollinator came. We got really sunburned that day, so always make sure to wear a hat. But one of the things we noticed was it wasn't as straightforward as this, because even at these high elevation sites, there was differences in the pollinators themselves that were coming there. And so what we saw is if you looked at the subspecies, most of the pollinators that came to the gray sites were similar. So see how all these grays are kind of clustering together. That means they had a lot of similar pollinators coming to them. And these were mainly made out of like moths and wasps. Especially a lot of the pollinators we see that do better at lower elevations, especially moths because they can come out at night and survive in these higher temperatures that you usually get during the day. Whereas the higher elevation ones did too. You saw more bumblebees and other bee species coming to them, and also a lot of daytime stuff, taking advantage of that cooler air during the day. Driving these kind of differences was the shape of the flowers themselves. And these are very similar to each other, but they have very minute kind of difference in their anther size as well as their corolla size too. And these kind of small differences really make a big difference between these species. Because if you're a tiny little insect kind of flying around and you can barely reach your hand in, you're going to be able to kind of get more out of the cookie jar, so to speak, in this case. And so a lot of these insects had very good preference based on their size and where they're at too. So the final thing we really want to do though is, okay, these are obviously differing in their pollinators and their traits, but the real test is, are they really selfish with their pollinators? Are we not seeing pollen moving from one to the other? And so we went out at night and we put a bunch of red fluorescent pollen on one subspecies, and then we put green fluorescent pollen on the other. And we spent a couple weeks just kind of running around these mountains with UV lights. This is where UFO stories come from. It's actually the Rotter Lab running around outside. So if you ever see something, just ask. And usually the aliens will come to you and explain they're doing a pollination trial. But what we did is we were able to see as the insects were kind of doing their business during the day and moving this pollen around, they were also picking up this fluorescent pollen. And we would find it kind of move. So this, you can see the red pollen in the background, and this one got a little bit of green pollen deposited on it. And so it takes a lot of time to find these. So it took us quite a bit. And we actually got rained out one week. And so we had to do it all over again. And that's just how life is as a scientist. So it is okay. But what we were finding is at these kind of lower elevation sites, we had this like nice back and forth, pollen is getting freely exchanged on the subspecies. And every now and then you would see an event where pollen was taken into the green. But we never saw an instance of the high elevation ones kind of donating pollen back. So what we start to see is these reinforcement of the genes of the low elevation subspecies there. And so they were kind of bullying out and keeping the pollinators to themselves. They weren't accepting anything from these. This was kind of mirrored in, but a lot stronger at the high elevation sites where we only saw really one-way interactions, where these green subspecies were exchanging pollen, but kind of leaving out these low elevation species. So they just kind of got up there and they just weren't having any luck in the dating pool, essentially. And then at mid-site, we saw kind of another kind of weird thing where we saw these high elevation ones or low elevation ones were again giving genes to the high elevation ones, but the high elevation ones were being stingy and only giving genes to the other high elevation ones. And so what we see is kind of a slow separation. They're kind of getting into the relationships they want, and probably because of the shapes and the sizes and a lot of the abiotic conditions, those kind of weather differences that were going on at these sites, we started to see this kind of stinginess of the relationship. And they're really getting into essentially a committed relationship is what they were doing. And so we see this kind of playing out in a lot of plants. And the thing I want to point out, though, is that this isn't the only story of rabbitbush. Rabbitbush has a lot of other stuff it needs to deal with. This is only just one aspect of its life, like a lot of plants. And so it's always important to think about, it's not just the pollinators driving these things. Pollinators are incredibly important. And I would say if we went back in a couple thousand years, that these would be different species and they wouldn't be able to breed with any anymore. But there's a lot of things going on, like soil conditions are really different. You can see like this higher elevations, the plants, there's a lot more plants going on because the soils are better. But at lower elevations, it's really patchy. There's a lot of cinders. It's hard for these plants to grow. And they also have enemies that don't want help them at all, that are herbivores, that are trying to just kill the plant and take it and really kind of not give anything at all. And so the plants really need to worry about this as well. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for kind of listening to the story of pollinators. And with that, I'll leave you with this fun picture when I was a mascot for the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy as their California poppy. And I can take any last minute questions that you guys have.
That's a great photo.
Thanks. I don't share it with any of my students. It's very important.
Well, if anybody has any last minute questions, you feel free, you can type them into the chat and I'll ask, or we might be opening up to a tiny bit of chaos, but if you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question to Mike, please feel free. I know I have one or two, but please feel free. I will let everyone else go first. Andy's saying that was a great presentation and thanking you, Mike. I completely agree. I don't know about you all, but whenever I hear Mike talk, I get a sense of kind of desolation that I didn't choose to go into botany.
Yeah. I thank you so much for those comments. And yeah, you know, we all kind of end up in these spots. And I definitely, fell for the flower trick for sure. So.
Oh, lots of fun and color. Thank you. So I had one, and again, if anybody wants to unmute themselves and just say, hey, I have a question, please feel free. But my question is, I found this so interesting. I really had no idea all of the ins and outs of this entire universe happening between the pollinators and their plants. And I guess what I'm wondering is, in terms of invasive species regimes, would you say that one of the kind of biggest aspects of the success of an invasion regime for an angiosperm then would be success with pollinators?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. It's such a good strategy, especially because a lot of times if you're new to the neighborhood, and if you have this kind of flower, especially if you don't have enemies that you have to worry about protecting that flower from, it's a really kind of a good strategy. It's probably one of the reasons why we don't have a lot of invasive pines around there. There's a few kind of big ones that we've planted on purpose and moved around, but a lot of, really what you see is most of our invasives are angiosperms out there, because, if you can, put some resources in that you don't have to worry about kind of a bad guy getting from you, you can really, be very attractive to the neighborhood kind of thing.
Very cool.
And especially too, as we have a decline in a lot of our native pollinators from habitat changes. One thing I like to point out is honeybees aren't native to North America, and they're great pollinators, but they don't really like our natives as much as some of the non-natives. And so that's another kind of piece that allows these non-natives to really get a good foothold.
That's so interesting. So it's kind of like our non-native plants and our non-native pollinators are coming in hand and swooping in.
Yeah, it's really, it's one thing to really think about with non-natives. It's always, it's not just one thing. It's usually a lot of landscape change that causes that. And one of the reasons why like restoration projects matter so much, even like a small one, can really go a long way to kind of give our natives like a more of a foothold to kind of allow them to get back on their game.
Wow, that is so amazing. Thank you so much, Mike, for everything. Cindy and Marilyn also send their thanks. And thank you all for coming tonight. I would be very remiss if I didn't plug a couple of things in our last few minutes together. So Mike has done this perfectly, talking about native plants and how important they are, and our sale. We are having a native plant sale. It is a curbside pickup sale, but on Friday, when the curbside pickup will be happening, there will be a select amount of plants that are available for in-person buying. So if you haven't checked out our website yet, www.watsonvillewetlandswatch.org, feel free to go. It's the very first thing that'll pop up for you. You can check out our native plant selections, make an order if you'd like. Very good prices, in my opinion. We also are going to be having another speaker series at around this time next month. Keep your eye out on your inbox if you're signed up for our newsletter, or if you follow us on social media, Instagram or Facebook, we'll be making another announcement there. And then finally, if you are interested in helping our native plants in Watsonville, and particularly in our native plant gardens and around our restoration sites, we are recruiting for volunteers. So Garden Gurus comes and works in our native plant habitat garden. And then we also have prolific propagators. They come and see us once a week, and they do a huge assortment of different propagation tools that do a huge amount for our restoration projects. So a lot of the plants that go to our restoration projects come from our propagator help. If you're interested in that, I will type my email into our chat box, and you can also, of course, find me on our website. I'm Noelle at watsonvillewetlandswatch.org. And you can email me and let me know that you're interested. This is entirely, if you are like me and you have a very brown thumb and you like plants, but you're very bad at growing them, that is okay. We do not need any experts. We have a group of really wonderful staff and volunteers that will lead you through anything and everything. So with that, if we don't have any final questions for Mike, I will say again, Mike, this was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us about this really cool world. And thank you all so much for joining us. And I hope we'll get to see you at our next talk.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate everybody's being here. And yeah, get out and enjoy fun pollinators and plants. So
awesome. Thank you all so much again. Have a wonderful evening.